1,000 years ago, over 100,000 man-made earthen mounds graced the North American landscape east of the Mississippi River, and some to the west. Some were conical, peaked burial mounds. Others flat-topped, designed to support pole buildings, while others had been formed as effigy mounds in the shape of animals, both common and extinct. Many smaller mounds had been placed carefully, oriented so as to determine the timing of celestial events, like many prehistoric megalithic structures worldwide. Most of the mound sites had been places of habitation, often located near a river, but a few large earthworks seem to have been dedicated ceremonial centers like Poverty Point in Louisiana. We do not know what the people living there called their cities, towns, and villages, but they were certainly the ancestors of the present-day Native Americans. Linguists claim there were 600 languages in the Americas, many from 5 to 7 language groups, and others completely unrelated. Archaeologists have divided ancient America into different time periods, but more importantly for our study, different cultural periods. The dates they present do vary depending on which university one is using for a reference. The Adena culture built mounds for 1,000 years, from 1000 BC to 0. The Hopewell culture built mounds for 700 years, from 200 BC to 500 CE. That was followed by a 500-year lull in mound building. Then, the Mississippian cultures built mounds for 300 years from 1000 CE to 1300 CE. No one knows how old some of the stone structures found in North America are. But they claim the building of earthen mounds began with the Adena culture in roughly 1000 BC. That date could be considered questionable because of earlier sites. The Lower Jackson Mound near Poverty Point in Louisiana dates back thousands of years earlier. One way or another, the Adena culture flourished until about year 0 and produced some very interesting artifacts that I will be showcasing in a special video. Many Adena sites were clustered in Ohio. In the same area were many Hopewell sites. Hopewell culture began all over the East prior to the dissolution of the Adena peoples, so they must have lived near one another for 100 or 200 years or so and shared cultures. They did both build mounds. They did both smoke pipes and more. The Hopewell culture flourished and built mounds for 700 years until 500 AD. What followed was a dramatic decline in population for 500 years across North America. That was followed by a worldwide warming period, during which time Native Americans began to cultivate maize. Finally, mound building began again in 1000 CE. Eventually, Cahokia, Illinois boasted a population of over 20,000 people during what the archaeologists call the Mississippian period, which flourished for 300 years. The reason for the demise of the Mississippian period remains a mystery, one that has fomented plenty of speculation. In Moundville, Alabama, and Cahokia, people began to leave in about 1300 and had completely abandoned the sites as habitations by 1400. In fact, all of the mound sites, thousands of them, were abandoned at that same time. Further, it seems The larger places of habitation were abandoned all across North America during that period as well. We shall be delving into this mystery in another special video. Today, we will first look at the types of artifacts archaeologists associate with the Adena culture, then their controversial physiology, and finally, we will investigate the cover-up of that physiology. The Adena were the earliest of the mound builders that we know of in North America. In the introduction, I stated that the Adena people built mounds from 1000 BC to 0. That really was a simplified average to make it easier to understand the overall concept. Some mainstream sources still put the early date at 500 BC, others at 900 BC or 1200 BC. Clearly, these numbers are too low, as there have been plenty of Adena mound and earthwork sites carbon dated far earlier. When did they begin to build mounds? We do not know. Some archaic burials have been found under or near Adena mounds. The Elizabeth group of 14 mounds was situated on a bluff overlooking the Illinois River in Pike County. What they consider an archaic feature beneath Mound 1 of the group contains the remains of 5 individuals, along with Middle Archaic Helton points. The remains were carbon dated to roughly 4300 BC. Above this tomb in the mound were found other burials from a later period. This is a typical feature of many burial mounds and have been termed intrusive burials. Concerning the end of the Adena culture, it seems there were artifacts and burials as late as 275 AD, those primarily in mounds along with Hopewell burials. By that time, the Adena people had been living near or with the Hopewell peoples for at least 400 years. The styles of the Adena and Hopewell builders were different, though. The early Adena mostly built conical burial mounds, some surrounded by a sloping circular trench and an embankment. The Adena are also probably responsible for the construction of many of the effigy mounds, as well as some of the massive earthworks. Some Adena mounds were built of stone, and many had stone incorporated into the mounds. One of the most common features of an Adena mound is the clay floor underneath the burials and tree bark protecting the bodies. Also, mortuary structures like small pole buildings or slabs of stone or central log tombs were often used to house the bodies inside the mounds. In Adena times, mounds were often constructed at high elevations among hilltops and mountains. By contrast, Hopewellian people constructed burial mounds upon the middle terraces of river valleys. Also, many Hopewellian geometric enclosures were elaborately aligned to celestial events, including the cardinal directions, the phases of the moon, and the solstices and equinoxes. Archaeologists have a list of 122 types of artifacts they associate with Adena cultures. Among those is a long list of pottery types and spear point types. Here is a short list. Very common in Adena sites are copper bracelets, copper rolled beads, tubular blocked-end smoking pipes, mica, bone beads, reel-shaped gorgets, charcoal, plain gorgets, red or yellow ochre, sandal sole gorgets, and hematite. Physiology. This is where it gets interesting. First, the shape of the typical Adena skull was round and high vaulted, compared to the Hopewellian square head. The Adena jaw was massive, with prominent and bilateral chins. These folks had big, broad faces. The teeth were huge, and sometimes included supernumerary teeth, as in double rows of teeth. To put it mildly, they were big-boned, even individuals that were not particularly tall. At the Dover Mound in Mason County, Kentucky, William S. Webb, head of Department of Archaeology at University of Kentucky, found in 1951 what he thought were the remains of a shaman in burial number 9. The man had been ruggedly built, 35 to 40 years old, and 5 foot 5 inches, or 1.65 meters, tall. Beneath the skull were 2 large mica sheets, and on each side of the jaw were 2 parts of the jaw of a puma. 2 copper bracelets adorned the left arm, a copper spiral ring on the left hand, and a copper pendant at the left shoulder. Mica crescents lay at the feet of the burial. Webb thought the artifacts had once been part of a puma man cape. In that same mound, Professor Webb encountered the unique physical type previously described in the old reports from the Bureau of Ethnology and the early antiquarians from the 1800s. Burial number 40 was a man from 25 to 30 years old with a skull-to-foot measurement of 84 inches. This man had been 7 feet tall. The individual had a large but proportional head and a very thick skull. Many of the earlier reports claimed that the skulls of the large individuals were 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters thick. This was a find by an accredited archaeologist on a formal dig in the mid-20th century, but was not a unique find. Between 1850 and 1900, hundreds of reports of skeletons over 2 meters tall appeared. Contemporary Orthodox archaeologists laugh and scoff at all of this in a smug, schoolboy fashion. Where is the evidence, they ask? Good question. Where are the large skeletons? In 1879, Congress established the Bureau of Ethnology as a branch of the Smithsonian Institution, and in 1881 modified the act to allow funding for excavations of mound sites in the Mississippi Valley. Between 1882 and 1886, Bureau agents excavated over 2,000 mounds in 140 counties, obtaining 40,000 artifacts, including many large skeletal remains. The discoveries were then reviewed by the entomologist and evangelical Lutheran minister Cyrus Thomas, who routinely edited discoveries out of the reports, as well as making many, quote, errors, unquote, in his reviews, attributing incorrect dimensions and contents to many of the earthworks and mounds. Fortunately, since field agents discovered and recorded the remains of many large skeletons, some found their way into public record. The reports number in the thousands. But to avoid tedium, we will look at one example. P.W. Norris recorded in the following discovery during his 1883 excavation of the Great Smith Mound in Charleston, West Virginia, published in the 12th Annual Report of American Ethnology in 1894. Quote, 19 feet from the top, in the remains of a bark coffin, a skeleton measuring 7½ feet in length and 19 inches across the shoulders was discovered. It lay on the bottom of the vault, stretched horizontally on the back. Each wrist was encircled by 6 heavy copper bracelets. Unquote. The New York Times also reported on the large skeleton from the Great Smith Mound, November 20th edition, 1883. Well-documented excavations sponsored by other official institutions like the Carnegie Institute and Yale University also discovered large skeletal remains, some of which were shipped to those institutions. Those shipments are all categorically denied today. All across the country, when unusual artifacts or earthworks were found by farmers, antiquarians, or homeowners digging out a foundation, they would typically call in a local newspaper to investigate. The reporters may have been unschooled in archaeology, but the articles number in the thousands and for over 100 years. Some reports were from local archaeological societies, civic engineers, and doctors. The contemporary claims that this was a conspiracy is absurd, and the slurs that farmers were not skilled enough to measure correctly is an insult to farmers worldwide. There are simply too many reports over too long a period to discount in such a cavalier fashion. The smoking gun is expressed in one word: eugenics. A philosophy that was embraced by the most notorious psychopath of the 20th century, one Adolf Hitler. We all know the narrative. The master race, tall blonde Nordics that were purportedly superior to the rest of humanity. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton after the publication of his book in 1869, Hereditary Genius, which drew heavily on the work of his cousin, Charles Darwin, and was eagerly embraced by the British power establishment to justify genetic elitism. Galton believed that the elite caste deserved to inherit wealth and power and should propagate by arranged marriages, while the reproductive rights of the lesser castes should be heavily regulated, even by forced sterilizations. Twisted as this was, it was not a new idea. From time immemorial, rulers have often promoted the notion that their bloodline is suited to rule and endorsed by a god or goddess. Of course, they were playing on the ancient idea of divine kingship, which may have originated with the Nephilim. According to that narrative, the Anunnaki were bigger and technically advanced, but unfortunately for them, the human genetics they manipulated were more psychic and empathic, which threatened their positions of power from the inside. So that narrative didn't really work then. In 1808, an early voice of Aryanism was Frederick Schlegel in his work Language and Wisdom of the Indians. Then came others. The Scottish Thomas Carlyle, who promoted Anglo-Saxonism. Then the French aristocratic Arthur de Gobineau, with his 2-volume opus in 1853, The Inequality of Human Races. Another French author was the anthropologist Georges Vacher de la Puig and his 2 works, Social Selections in 1896, and The Aryan, His Social Role in 1899, which later served as inspiration for Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World. a tongue-in-cheek take on it he deemed, quote, an ordered universe in a world of planless incoherence, unquote. Then there was Houston Stewart Chamberlain, originally an Englishman who became a German citizen in 1916 and wrote propaganda for the German government during World War I. He'd written The Foundations of the 19th Century, published in 1899, which later became a cornerstone of the Nazi Party. But by that time, the stage was set, and the first act occurred in, of all places, the land of the free, financed by the creatures from Jekyll Island. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Harriman, and their ilk. Once the Americans got hold of the movement, it got uglier. After 100 years of philosophy, Americans actualized it. The creatures financed the American Eugenics Society, the Immigration Restriction League, the International Committee on Eugenics, the Galton Society, and the Eugenics Records Office at Cold Springs Harbor. They successfully lobbied for the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 and the Racial Integrity Act in the same year, and in Virginia, the Eugenical Sterilization Act. From researcher Edwin Black, quote, in 1904, the Carnegie Institution established a laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island that stockpiled millions of index cards on ordinary Americans as researchers carefully plotted the removal of families, bloodlines, and whole peoples. From Cold Spring Harbor, eugenics advocates agitated in the legislatures of America, as well as the nation's social service agencies and associations. The Harriman Railroad fortune paid local charities, such as the New York Bureau of Industries and Immigration, to seek out Jewish, Italian, and other immigrants in New York and other crowded cities and subject them to deportation, confinement, or forced sterilization, unquote. So here we must consider the psychology of the sociopathic mind. For the sociopath, competition is daily fare, consumed with breakfast and every other meal. The mythological Aryans were an idea, but these Adena people were bigger and stronger than the Nordic narrative and not blondes. And the Adena typicity displayed clearly a different skull type, roundheads versus the Nordic squareheads. At that time, the archaeologists were adamant concerning very accurate measurements of the skull. Some were trying to prove that Caucasian brain cavities were bigger than all others, and therefore smarter. But they got spanked on that one. The data was inconclusive. If anything, the African brain was bigger. That didn't work. And remember, the Adena people's heads were really big. And I must mention that these folks were particularly hostile towards Jewish people. We know that, but why? Why did they target Jews? Certainly the entrenched religious intolerance. But we must point out that sociopaths are typically not genuinely religious, only as far as it serves their interests. Of course, there is the irritating fact that Orthodox Jews taught their children that they were better than everyone else. That one has always been hard to swallow. So once again, the competition with the European banking industry. Shell oil versus Standard Oil. The Rothschilds versus the Rockefellers. The Thunderbird versus the Underwater Panther. So old Adolf didn't dream this one up. In fact, one of his important reference books was by an American author. He said, quote, "This one is my Bible," unquote, referring to Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race. Grant was a driving force behind the American eugenics movement. Now, a side note. This is merely a summary or primer concerning eugenics. It festers as one of the most unsavory facets of American history. And yet, it is related to the imbecilic notion of American exceptionalism, which still persists today. The original mission of the Department of Ethnology was not to conceal the existence of large skeletons found in many of the mounds. Rather, the Smithsonian had been compelled by interests concerned with the identity of the mound builders. Several early Secretary Generals of the Smithsonian were involved in a classic revolving door scenario associated with and also working for J.P. Morgan or Andrew Carnegie. It was not until the early 20th century that the policy of denial was enacted through the National Museum, instituted by one of the most notorious names in archaeology, Alice Hrdlicka. Looking at Hrdlicka from a distance, this was a man that could be psychologically diagnosed today as an extreme narcissist. He believed that humans did not enter the Americas earlier than 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and he was very aggressive about enforcing that idea on everyone around him. He regularly butted heads with other anthropologists such as young Louis Leakey. Hrdlicka began working for the Smithsonian in 1903 and became curator in 1910. He was an important member of the American Eugenics Society and was a speaker at the 1921 Second International Congress of Eugenics. Under the guidance of Hrdlicka, the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian engaged in full denial of the gigantic remains unearthed by its own agents during the 1880s. It is rumored that they took 2 barge loads of skeletons and dumped them off out in the Atlantic Ocean. That, of course, is speculative. Prior to the cover-up, other rather colorful players surfaced. The Freemasons became interested in an odd way, as well as the Rosicrucians. Even Madame Blavatsky weighed in. It seems the large, very well-preserved skeleton from Lovelock Cave immediately disappeared and was purportedly used in some kind of bizarre ritual. And the public got wind of it. So eventually, the practical reality of the existence of very large people in ancient North America gradually took on the ambiance of a circus freak show. In another video, I will tackle the controversial subject of ancient copper mining in America, which is associated with the Adena culture and what they call the Old Copper Complex. Until then, bonsoir, mon ami. Have a great evening.